Well, Donald Trump's win on Tuesday night is being considered one of the biggest political upsets in modern history. Going into Election Day, Democratic opponent Hillary Clinton was widely predicted to come out the winner. Nate Silver's 538 gave her a roughly 70% chance of winning, while the New York Times put her chances at 91%. But as we now know, that's not how it went down. So how did the pollsters in the Clinton campaign get it so wrong? We've got a great panel here to break it all down with us. In Washington, a CBS News senior political editor, Steve Chaggaris. In the Politico newsroom in Arlington, Virginia, is Politico's chief polling analyst, Steve Shepard. And on set here with me in New York, CBSN political contributor and Republican strategist, Leslie Sanchez, as well as CBS News elections director, Anthony Salvanto. Okay, Anthony, to you. I want to ask you, is there one particular voting bloc that these polling experts have missed?
Well, let's be very, very clear about the difference between polling aggregators and forecasters and polls. And I just don't think we can be clear enough about that difference.
What's the difference?
And the difference is that the polling aggregators and the forecasters are doing what you just described. And they're putting a percentage chance on what are the odds this candidate wins or loses.
You're talking about the Nate Silvers, the New York Times poll I referenced.
All of whom do terrific work. We all read it. We all think it's really interesting. Okay? And there's a difference between that and putting a percentage chance on a candidate and a poll. And a poll is, here's what people think at the time the poll is taken, right? Now, those are different products. If you want to know what people are thinking and feeling at that time, you use the poll. If you want to try to convert that and all those polls into a chance some outcome is going to happen, then you go to a forecaster. So I can speak for the polls, okay? And in that case, the question is, did Hillary Clinton at one point have a lead that in many of these states she subsequently lost? And I think the data is clear that she did have a lead. In fact, I think she had a lead as we were heading into Election Day that slipped away from her because of low turnout from Democrats and because the undecided voters went to Trump. And the way that you can see that is in the polls that we took, where we actually talked to voters right up until Election Day, in places like Ohio, where we had the shift to Trump, we had him up. In places like Florida, where we saw it become even after she had been leading. In Colorado, where we saw it tightening. You saw people shifting to Hillary Clinton. So in that respect, the polls were just fine. But if you look at the states where people didn't poll, where they left it alone for a while and just sort of let the forecast go, they were sort of written off as, well, those surely must be for Clinton. They always have been. And that's a place where we probably didn't pick up what was tightening subsequently.
Okay, Steve Shepard, I want to ask you, Clinton won millennial voters by 55%. President Obama won this group by 60% in 2012. How critical was this voting bloc for Hillary Clinton's campaign?
Well, there are a number of Democratic coalitions that did not come through in the same numbers that they did for Barack Obama. You can look as well at African-American voters in a lot of places, Philadelphia, Detroit, where Hillary Clinton's margins were similar, if only just off by a point or two, a couple of points from Barack Obama. But the turnout, the share of the electorate they represented in those states, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, was dwarfed. In some cases, that may be because they didn't turn out in the same numbers. In other cases, it may be that white voters outside both the cities and the suburbs turned out in greater numbers to vote for Donald Trump and diluted the influence of those key voters. It's the same thing with younger voters. Millennials were more likely to choose third-party candidates than older voters were. Those are votes that Hillary Clinton lost that Barack Obama might have won.
Okay, Leslie, I want to ask you about women. Hillary Clinton won women by 12 points, but she lost white women by 10 percentage points. How did that happen? What was Trump's appeal?
Well, there's certainly the fluctuation back and forth. I think Anthony really hits upon it when he was talking about those undecided voters. There is a strong suspicion that there were a lot of undecided, maybe uncommitted voters. They had decided, but perhaps were really waiting. And if you look at the number of voters that decided in the last month and in the last week, the last month was the debate. That was the first time you saw a very strong, different type, almost presidential-esque Donald Trump in that second debate. And then the issue, most importantly, I think with women, was Comey coming out 11 days before the election and saying that they were opening up this investigation into emails. Women, particularly undecided women, like third-party validation. These are kind of non-biased entities. If, for example, in this case, it would be the FBI. There's a bunch of credibility. While people have lost faith in public and private institutions, the military and federal law enforcement still have a degree of respect. And I think that was the deciding factor. Above all the noise, that was a point that women could really lean on.
Steve, I want to ask you, Clinton faltered with minority voters, doing worse actually with the black community and Hispanic voters than President Obama did in 2012. Was this an issue with voter enthusiasm, or was this something more, Steve Chaggaris?
I mean, she had a problem with voter enthusiasm, I think, across the board. You just look at the total vote, and she is 9 million votes off from where Barack Obama was in 2008, and about 5.5 million voters off of where he was in 2012. So, and by the way, Donald Trump was about even to where McCain and Romney were. So who had the problem getting the votes? It was Hillary Clinton across the board. Specifically in terms of African Americans, I think pretty much everybody was suspecting that she was going to have trouble getting the enthusiasm from that demographic group, mainly because the historic nature of Barack Obama's candidacy and presidency was what drove African Americans to the polls in 2008 and 2012. And she just didn't have that historic aspect in terms of African American voters. And so it shouldn't be too much of a surprise that she lost enthusiasm among that group. What's surprising, I think, to everybody is the fewer number of voters overall that came out for Hillary Clinton compared to Obama. I think that surprised a lot of people.
Anthony, I want to ask you about white voters, in particular with no college degree. Clinton lost them by 39 points. Rural voters, 28 points. What states did this hurt her the most?
Almost all the ones that she lost. Yeah, because what you saw was this sort of widespread, not only a turnout drop-off among where we might have expected traditional Democratic voters to turn out, but also wherever you found pockets of those white working class voters, they were much more heavily for Donald Trump. And, you know, I think obviously that'll have the Democratic Party going back and looking at what they can do to try to bring some of those voters back into the fold. She consistently didn't do as well with them as even Barack Obama had, you know, in his 2 elections. But where that mattered was mostly up across the upper Midwest. Those were part of the reason that, you know, Michigan looks like it's at least very close, why Wisconsin turned over, why she lost in part Iowa, all those states where you had a higher concentration of those kinds of voters, as opposed to places where she continued to still do okay. Colorado she hung on to, other battlegrounds, Virginia, for example, she hung on to, where she did well enough with college voters who, you know, were able to maintain part of that Obama coalition.
There was some buzz that one report that said specifically Bill Clinton had been pushing for them to reach out to these blue-collar workers, which he did really well with in 1992, but obviously they were a different couple back then. Was it illusional for them to think that this voting bloc, looking at blacks, Hispanics, the groups that they were targeting would have been enough to push him to victory? Well,
they were clearly trying to replicate part of that Obama coalition with a little tweak, which is that she might have done better among white suburban women than he had, and that might offset. We saw these declines for her all the way back through the primaries. These are the same sort of voters that she struggled with. Even as we talked about the Bernie Sanders phenomena and how he was drawing all those young voters, she was also struggling with those same type of voters in the Democratic primaries. So this, in that sense, is not new, but they thought, I think they thought anyway, that they might have been able to offset that by doing better with those suburban women. And then when that fell short, and when turnout fell short, it was just too much.
Okay, Steve Shepard, why might the battleground polls that Clinton showed leading ahead on Election Day have been so way off, particularly in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan?
Well, those are the 3 key states, and I think Anthony represented that perfectly. Look, part of it is, as Anthony suggested, and Leslie suggested too, when those polls were conducted. The final polls in Wisconsin were conducted a week before Election Day. And when you look at the Wisconsin exit poll, Donald Trump won voters who decided in the final week of the campaign 59% to 30%. He only won those voters nationally by 10 points, but he won triple them at the rate in Wisconsin. These are shifts potentially in the final weeks of the campaign that the polls missed because the pollsters stopped polling. Now, these pollsters don't necessarily have a mandate to forecast the election. They're trying to discern how the electorate feels about the candidates, about the issues at play, not necessarily make a dead-on prediction about who's going to win. And so long as that's the attitude, we have to calibrate our expectations, both when we talk here on television and when forecasters that Anthony mentioned use these to form a percentage chance of each candidate winning, we need to calibrate our expectations about what these polls can tell us about what's actually going to happen on Election Day.
Leslie, I want to ask you, do you think that Trump's campaign has effectively shifted the way we look at the electoral map? There were some states we thought traditionally red or traditionally blue. Did they completely change that?
Absolutely, and it's not the first time. I think if you go back, we say a generation is about 25 years. You go back 24 years ago, you had Ross Perot earning 19 million votes. There were people that was focused on the economy. They came out, and affected in the third way. The difference with Donald Trump is, Ross Perot was outside the system. Bernie Sanders tried to run within the system because there was a disgruntled voter group there. But Donald Trump effectively ran within the Republican Party, which was basically able to bring all of it together. I think the other interesting thing, building on these 2 points, is in all those competitive battleground states, you never saw Hillary above 50% or at 50. And from a political axiom, we always say if you're not at 50% going in, then that's a red flag. And so she's at 45, 42, consistently through that. We knew she was seen as the incumbent, and an incumbent should be at 50. If they're not, it was tea leaves all the way along.
So you're saying that 50% number or more is a crucial thing to look at when you're looking at
it was an indicator that always said there was a red flag in that position, and with the fact that you had white turnout, but blue-collar jobs. It's an area that the Democrats have been struggling with for several election cycles, and there's several books written about this. And if you can't rely entirely on just certain minority voting groups, you have to really be able to split the vote a little more evenly.
What do you think happened in Florida, Leslie?
In Florida, there's such. Basically, I would think a lot of the Latino and the Puerto Rican Cuban that they talked about was neutralized by the massive turnout in Tampa and other parts of the northern and the eastern part of the state. So it counterbalanced that, and you're still talking about smaller numbers. And I don't think when you look at ethnic voters, you can't be monolithic about it. People talked a lot about Trump and the Latino vote, which is predominantly Mexican American. He got 29%. Republicans have earned about 31% for the last 10 presidential elections. So he's not necessarily underperforming by a big enough margin like a Dole, Bob Dole, and 21%. He's really consistent, and it shows how dynamically fluid the Latino community is.
So fascinating. Steve Chaggaris, Trump's campaign manager, Kellyanne Conway, said on CBS this morning that part of Trump's biggest appeal was that he was an outsider. Did Clinton go into the general election with that disadvantage, since she pretty much epitomizes the establishment?
Oh, there's no question. I mean, if you look at polling all throughout this campaign and then in the exit polls, the country thinks we're on the wrong track. And they also, those voters who said they want to change, voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump. And I think, Hillary Clinton, not only the fact that she's been in government for so long, that her husband was president, but also I think the email story sort of magnifies this insider aspect to Hillary Clinton. I mean, how much more insider does this get than this email story? And I think that just resonated with people to the point where you have two really different candidates here. One who has never held public office and who is talking about breaking up or busting up Washington, smashing it up and changing things. And then you have the other person who's been a creature of Washington for decades. That choice is pretty clear for voters, and I think we saw how they broke on Election Day.
Steve Chaggaris, Politico's Steve Shepard, and our Leslie Sanchez and Anthony Salvanto, thank you all for joining us.
Thanks.
Thank you.